Welcome back. A lot of stations are going through this repack process, ordering equipment, scheduling climbers, installing, and they may be missing a vital piece of the puzzle, their lease. So in this episode, we're going to explain in a bit more detail what a lease audit is and why you need one. The leasing portion of the project will really set the pace for everything else, so stay tuned. Some stations are lucky enough to own their own tower, but in many cases, your tower space and even ground space might be leased from a landlord. This means there's a contract somewhere that states exactly what you can and can't do on the tower and within your lease space. I hate to say it, but we've seen so many stations not check their tower lease before installing equipment. Sometimes they think a simple phone call or a notification to the landlord will serve as enough approval. If you have this type of relationship with your landlord, great, but you still need to document the changes. If you don't know by now, the reason you document everything is for liability purposes. If something happens during your install or even years down the road, you better hope that you have a document that helps your case. It might not even be as bad as a tower collapse or a climber falling. It could be as simple as an argument about back rent. From what we've seen, the majority of stations in repack are tenants on a tower, and they're renting space to be there. So it's a business relationship with the landlord, and those landlords usually want any changes recorded, obviously. That's where the actual leasing documents come into play. So let's take a minute to talk about the actual lease itself, because that's where a lot of folks get tripped up. The lease will tell you exactly what equipment you're authorized to have on the tower. Most leases are structured in a way that have a table or a list at the end of the document, usually in an exhibit, that states what equipment is allowed. Getting a copy of this document is really the first step in even thinking about changing equipment on a tower. Now, if you've been in the business for a while, you know that the process of reviewing those lease documents and figuring out what you're leased for and what it will take to get you licensed for the new configuration is called a lease audit, and it's usually performed by an outside firm familiar with negotiating tower leases, many times referred to as a site acquisition firm. Most stations will send this to their attorneys for them to process and review, but we've seen a lot of attorneys miss items just because they're not used to reading leases in bulk, like a more specialized site acquisition company. But regardless of who you decide to have review your lease documents, the cost of that review is reimbursable. It's usually billed as a flat rate and could end up saving you thousands over the term of the lease. Now let's talk really quickly about the elephant in the room. Large tower management companies that have included in their contract that they do their own site acquisition services. You probably know who they are at this point or whether you're on one of their towers. Part of their in-house services includes a lease audit, which many people think will save time and hassle of trying to source a third-party site ac firm. I mean, who doesn't want a full-service turnkey provider, right? The problem here is that you have somewhat of a fox guarding the henhouse situation. If the tower owner is performing the lease audit, you are completely trusting that they are looking out for you in their review. However, as we mentioned earlier, these landlords are businesses, so they are somewhat incentivized to look after themselves first. That's not to say they're bad people. We've worked with many of these large corporations over the years and have great relationships with them. We just also know that it is industry standard to have another entity acting on behalf of the tenant perform their own review and perform their own lease audit. That way they can compare it to the landlord version. This is one of the few instances in repack where there might be seemingly overlapping services, but in reality, both are considered normal course of business and completely reimbursable. If you have any questions regarding reading your lease, getting a lease audit, or negotiations in general, feel free to reach out. See you later.